his own recorded words undermining the calm story he tried to construct in the present. Whatever trust the community had clung to, however thin it had already worn over years of dismissed complaints, finally gave way entirely inside that chamber, replaced by something closer to quiet, exhausted anger. Myron Hale, the off-duty nurse who had refused to lower her phone that rainy night, testified next, describing calmly what she had witnessed from 20 feet away with no obstruction and no reason to lie. Her account matched the footage exactly, detail for detail, and she added one observation that seemed to settle over the room heavier than anything else said that day. She told the council that in years living 3 blocks from that pharmacy, she had watched some version of that same stop happen to at least 6 other people she personally knew, none of whom had ever been carrying a federal badge in their pocket. She said she had filed a complaint after one of those earlier incidents herself and had never once received a response. The chamber went quiet again, differently this time. The silence of people recognizing that the woman on trial that day was never truly the only victim in this story, only the one whose case finally could not be buried. Weeks later, the Department of Justice released its findings in a report that ran to several hundred pages, detailing patterns of unconstitutional stops, falsified documentation, and retaliation against officers who had tried to report misconduct through proper channels. 9 officers faced formal suspension. 4 faced criminal charges ranging from falsifying records to civil rights violations, and 2 lost their certifications permanently, barred from ever wearing a badge again in any jurisdiction within the state. The deputy chief resigned quietly before the report's public release, avoiding cameras entirely on his way out of a building he had once run with near total authority. Within weeks, the entire command structure of the department had been dismantled and rebuilt from outside leadership brought in specifically to avoid the old loyalties that had allowed the culture to persist for so long. The city agreed to a court-supervised reform plan complete with retraining programs, revised use-of-force policies, mandatory data reporting on every stop and search conducted, and an independent oversight board with real subpoena power for the first time in the department's long, quiet history. Victor Langford resigned the same week the Department of Justice report became public, reading a brief statement to a small cluster of reporters gathered outside the station he had led for years. He did not apologize directly, choosing instead to speak in careful phrases about accepting responsibility for systemic failures that had occurred, in his words, under his watch, rather than by his direct design. Few in the crowd believed the distinction mattered much, and few repeated his statement without noting how carefully it avoided the word wrong. He left the building that afternoon through a side entrance, avoiding the cameras stationed at the front, and was never again seen in any official capacity connected to law enforcement in that state. Serena never gave a lengthy statement to the press throughout any of it, never appeared eager to claim credit for what unfolded after that single rainy night beneath a flickering streetlight. When reporters pressed her outside the courthouse following the hearing, microphones crowding close around her face, she offered only a single sentence delivered without heat or triumph in her voice. "Accountability protects everyone." She said it plainly, the way she said most things that mattered. And then she walked past the cameras without another word, leaving the reporters to fill their broadcasts with whatever meaning they chose to attach to those 3 words. Months passed, and the department that had once quietly terrified its own citizens began to look cautiously like something new was actually taking root inside it. New officers walked the same streets under new leadership, trained under revised policies that required documented justification for every stop, every search, every use of force before it could be logged as closed. Body cameras that had once mysteriously malfunctioned at convenient moments now streamed directly to an independent server outside the department's control, reviewed weekly by members of the new oversight board. Implicit bias training, once treated as a checkbox exercise squeezed into a single afternoon, became a mandatory component woven into every training cycle, revisited regularly rather than forgotten after one session and never mentioned again. Slowly, residents who had stopped calling the police out of fear began speaking with officers on their own porches again, tentative but present, testing carefully whether the change happening around them was real or simply cosmetic, dressed up for cameras. A few families who had filed complaints years earlier finally received letters acknowledging what had happened to them, letters that arrived far too late to undo the harm, but early enough to mean something all the same. Iris Colton received one of those letters on a quiet afternoon, opening it at her kitchen table with hands that trembled slightly as she read the department's formal acknowledgement of what her nephew had experienced years before. She placed the letter in a drawer beside an old photograph of him, not because the words fixed anything that had already happened, but because for the first time since his arrest, Someone in an official capacity had finally admitted in writing that he had been telling the truth all along. The new Independent Oversight Board held its first public session on a warm evening in autumn, attended by more residents than any council meeting the city had hosted in years. Members of the board, chosen specifically from outside the department's old network, reviewed a stack of body camera footage from the preceding weeks, checking each stop against the newly required documentation standards. They found the vast majority compliant, a handful requiring follow-up questions, and one requiring formal review, a ratio that would have been unthinkable under the old command structure barely a year earlier. Residents in attendance applauded quietly at the end of the session, not because the work was finished, but because for the first time in longer than most of them could remember, someone was actually watching closely and writing down what they saw. Serena returned to Washington not long after the hearings concluded, back to an office that looked much like it had before she left, stacks of files still waiting patiently on the corners of her desk. A colleague, curious about the toll months of quiet surveillance must have taken on her, asked her one evening over coffee if it had all been worth the cost to her personally. She looked out the window for a moment before answering, watching the lights of the city flicker against an early evening sky, the color of faded denim. "It was never about one arrest," she said finally, her voice quiet but entirely certain of itself. "It was about changing what everyone thought could never change." Somewhere far south in the town where it had all begun on a rainy sidewalk outside a pharmacy, a maintenance crew removed the old department sign from its post outside the station, replacing it with something newer, something that no longer carried the invisible weight of dozens of unanswered complaints behind its lettering. The building looked much the same from the outside, brick and glass under an ordinary sky, cars parked in the same familiar rows along the same cracked pavement. But everything inside it now answered to eyes that had not been watching before, to systems that no longer forgot as conveniently as they once had. Officers who once believed themselves above scrutiny now filed reports knowing someone somewhere would actually read them carefully and ask questions if the details did not line up. Elias Crow stayed on the force, promoted quietly within the first year of reform, often the first to remind newer recruits why documentation mattered more than instinct alone. Nobody in that city forgot the rainy night a woman in a plain dark coat had been cuffed on a public sidewalk for the crime of simply walking home from a conference that evening. Myron Hale kept the original footage from her phone long after the trial concluded, storing it carefully the way some people store letters from relatives who have passed, not because she needed to watch it again, but because she understood its weight. She told a local reporter in one of the only interviews she ever agreed to give that she had not filmed that night hoping to become part of any larger story. She had simply refused, in that particular moment, to let a woman disappear quietly into a system that had disappeared so many people before her without consequence. Her footage, stitched together with dozens of other clips from strangers she never met, became part of a training module the new department eventually used to teach incoming officers exactly what unlawful escalation looked like from the outside, frame by frame, second by second. Harlan Voss never worked in law enforcement again, his certification revoked permanently by a state board that reviewed his record alongside the footage from that night and found nothing left to defend. He moved out of the county within a year, according to public records, and declined every request for comment that followed him afterward. Sterling Croft, the deputy chief who had once advised his officers on how to phrase their way around federal scrutiny, faced his own separate hearing months later, his calm authority replaced by the same defensive stammering he had once mocked in weaker men beneath him. Quentin Marsh retired quietly under a cloud he never fully escaped, his name occasionally resurfacing whenever residents discussed how long the old system had been allowed to run unquestioned. A single federal badge did not on its own tear down an entire police department built over decades of habit and silence. It was the years of unchecked power, the quiet culture of assumption dressed up as instinct, the falsified reports and buried complaints stacked one on top of another that finally collapsed under the weight of their own construction. Serena Vaughn had not set out to destroy anything that particular night beneath the streetlight. She had only waited, calm and unhurried, for the truth to reveal itself exactly as it always eventually does, whenever someone finally stops long enough and stays long enough to actually look. The first time since the confrontation began that Naomi allowed herself to speak with the full weight of her position, rather than simply the patience of a private citizen enduring an injustice. "I am Justice Naomi Harlan of the State Supreme Court," she said clearly, her voice calm but unmistakably firm, carrying easily across the silent crowd that had gathered to witness the entire ordeal. The words landed with the force of confirmation rather than surprise, settling into a crowd that had already begun to suspect as much, yet still felt the full gravity of hearing it spoken aloud. She did not raise her voice to make the statement feel more dramatic. She did not need to. The simple truth of who she was, combined with everything the crowd had just witnessed, carried more weight than any performance could have achieved. Pratt nodded slowly, his expression grim, already understanding that this moment marked only the beginning of consequences that would ripple far beyond that single morning. In the time that followed, the department's Internal Affairs Division opened a formal investigation, moving with a speed and seriousness rarely afforded to complaints involving officers like Grant Ellison. Investigators pulled body cam footage that confirmed every detail captured by bystanders, the audio painfully clear in its documentation of escalating hostility that had no basis in any actual threat or violation. Surveillance footage from the grocery store's exterior cameras offered another angle, showing Naomi calmly loading groceries long before Ellison ever approached, undermining any claim that her behavior had appeared suspicious in any reasonable sense. Traffic camera footage from a nearby intersection added still more context, while the original livestream, already viewed by an enormous and growing audience, provided perhaps the most damning record of all, capturing every word and gesture with unforgiving clarity. Investigators found no inconsistency between any of these sources, no detail that offered Ellison even a sliver of justification for his actions that morning. Each piece of evidence aligned perfectly with the others, painting a picture of an officer who had escalated a routine encounter into a near catastrophe based entirely on unfounded suspicion rooted in prejudice rather than fact. As the investigation deepened, officials began revisiting Ellison's personnel file, a record that had quietly accumulated complaints over the years without ever triggering serious consequences. Multiple citizens, the vast majority of them black men and women, had filed reports describing eerily similar patterns: aggressive questioning without cause, escalation in response to calm cooperation, accusations rooted in assumption rather than evidence. Some of these earlier complaints had been dismissed outright, others quietly settled without any formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The kind of bureaucratic erasure that allowed patterns of misconduct to persist unchecked for years. Chief Pratt, reviewing the file personally for the first time with this new context in mind, felt a deepening unease as he recognized just how long these warning signs had existed without meaningful intervention. He realized, with a discomfort he could not easily dismiss, that the morning's events were not an isolated failure, but rather the predictable outcome of years of institutional negligence, a culture that had allowed one officer's biases to operate without sufficient oversight or accountability. This was not the first time. It was simply the first time the consequences had become impossible to ignore. Among the rediscovered complaints was a report filed years earlier by a young man named Jalen Vargas, who had described an encounter with Ellison almost identical in tone and escalation to what Naomi had endured. That complaint had been closed within a matter of weeks, dismissed for what the file vaguely described as insufficient corroborating evidence, despite a bystander video that had been submitted alongside the written statement. Another complaint, filed by a grandmother who had simply been walking home from church, described nearly the same accusatory questioning, the same refusal to explain the legal basis for suspicion, the same hostility when she asked for clarity. Investigators began to understand that Naomi's encounter, however shocking to the public, represented not an aberration, but a culmination, the moment when a long pattern of quiet harm finally collided with a level of attention too large for the department to manage away. The pressure building from public attention, fueled by the widespread circulation of the original footage, eventually forced the department into a formal press conference held outside the same precinct where Ellison had worked for years. Officials announced his immediate suspension pending further review, a decision quickly followed by his formal termination once the internal investigation concluded that his conduct represented a clear and serious violation of departmental policy. Beyond the loss of his position, news outlets reported that a separate civil investigation had been opened, examining whether his actions that morning, and potentially in earlier incidents revealed during the broader review, constituted violations of constitutional rights warranting further legal consequences. His badge was formally surrendered during a brief and quiet ceremony witnessed by only a handful of department officials, a stark contrast to the public spectacle his actions had created. Reporters from across the region gathered outside the precinct that day, their cameras trained on a podium where Chief Pratt stood, flanked by 2 members of the city council and a representative from the mayor's office, each of them aware that the entire community was watching for signs of either genuine reckoning or hollow public relations. Pratt spoke without notes, choosing instead to address the matter directly, acknowledging that the department had failed not only Justice Harlan, but every resident who had ever felt unsafe in the presence of an officer sworn to protect them. He did not attempt to soften the language of accountability, refusing the kind of vague corporate phrasing that so often accompanies institutional apologies, and instead named the failure plainly as a result of bias left unchecked for far too long. A handful of residents who had gathered along the edges of the press conference applauded quietly when he finished speaking, not out of celebration, but out of a cautious and hard-won relief that perhaps this time something might actually change. In the aftermath of his termination, several of the earlier complainants whose grievances had previously been dismissed found renewed courage to speak publicly about their own experiences with Ellison, encouraged by the undeniable proof captured during Naomi's encounter. Their stories, once isolated and easily ignored, now formed a pattern that media outlets and civil rights organizations began examining collectively, painting a fuller picture of harm that had gone unaddressed for far too long. Justice Naomi Harlan, despite the very public nature of what had happened to her, made a deliberate choice not to use the moment for personal vindication or retaliation against the officer who had wronged her. She declined multiple interview requests in the days immediately following the incident, choosing instead to issue a single, carefully worded statement that focused not on her own anger, but on the broader principle the entire ordeal had exposed. "Justice must never depend on who you are," she said during a brief and dignified address delivered at a community event unrelated to the incident itself, her tone measured and free of bitterness despite everything she had endured. The line spread quickly across news coverage and public conversation, repeated in editorials and discussions far beyond the borders of her own state, resonating with people who recognized in her words something larger than one woman's personal experience. It became almost immediately a touchstone for broader conversations about accountability, about the dangers of unchecked bias within institutions meant to protect rather than harm, about the courage required to remain composed in the face of injustice, rather than allowing anger to define the response. Her restraint, many observers noted, carried far more power than outrage ever could have, precisely because it refused to mirror the very behavior that had caused the harm in the first place. In the time that followed the incident, the police department implemented sweeping changes that extended far beyond the termination of a single officer, reforms that Chief Pratt himself acknowledged were long overdue. Mandatory bias training became a required component of ongoing officer certification, developed in consultation with community leaders and civil rights advocates who had long pushed for exactly this kind of structural change. Body cameras, previously optional or inconsistently enforced, became a strict requirement for every patrol officer, with new policies mandating their continuous use during any interaction with the public, eliminating the gaps that had previously allowed questionable conduct to go undocumented. An independent oversight committee was established to review complaints with a level of scrutiny that had been notably absent in the years leading up to that single morning, ensuring that future warning signs would not be dismissed or buried the way so many had been before. The committee's first order of business was to revisit every complaint filed against any officer in the department over the years, a painstaking process that took considerable time to complete, but ultimately restored a measure of credibility to a system that had long felt one-sided to the very communities it was meant to serve. Several other officers, identified through this renewed scrutiny, faced disciplinary action of their own, though none of their cases carried quite the same public weight as the one that had triggered the entire review. Community forums were organized in the time that followed, giving residents a direct line to department leadership for the first time in years. An uncomfortable but necessary process that slowly began rebuilding trust, eroded over a long stretch of unanswered grievances. Pratt attended nearly every one of these sessions personally, choosing to absorb criticism directly rather than delegate the discomfort to subordinates, a decision that earned him a grudging respect even among residents who remained skeptical that real change was possible. It was slow, imperfect work, the kind that rarely made headlines once the initial outrage faded, but it represented exactly the sort of unglamorous accountability that the moment had demanded. Justice Naomi Harlan returned to her work on the bench almost immediately after the incident concluded, declining the spotlight that many expected her to embrace given the magnitude of public attention surrounding her case. She granted no extensive interviews, made no rounds on talk shows, and resisted every opportunity to frame herself as a symbol or a victim deserving of sustained public sympathy. She simply returned to the quiet discipline that had defined her entire career, presiding over cases with the same calm authority she had always brought to her work, treating the incident not as a defining moment of victimhood, but as a single difficult chapter within a much longer story of service. Colleagues who worked alongside her in the time that followed remarked on how little the experience seemed to have changed her outward demeanor, though many suspected, quietly, that something within her had shifted in ways too private to share. Later, a young law student approached her following a guest lecture she had delivered at a local university. His expression earnest and curious in the way only students grappling with difficult moral questions can be. He asked her directly, without preamble, how she had managed to remain so calm throughout an encounter that would have broken many people, an encounter where anger or fear would have been entirely understandable responses. She paused for a long moment before answering, her expression thoughtful rather than rehearsed, as though she were considering the question fully rather than reciting a polished line crafted for public consumption. "Because anger wins moments," she finally said, her voice soft but absolutely certain. "But integrity wins history." The student fell silent, absorbing the weight of those words in a way that seemed to settle something within him, a lesson he would likely carry through the rest of his own career. Naomi offered no further elaboration, no extended speech about the incident or its aftermath, simply allowing the statement to stand on its own, the way she had always allowed her rulings to speak for themselves rather than relying on grand explanation. She gathered her notes, thanked the student for his question, and walked out of the lecture hall with the same unhurried calm that had carried her through every difficult moment of her career, including the one that had nearly cost her so much on an ordinary morning that had begun with nothing more than a simple trip for groceries. What remained, long after the headlines faded and the department's reforms took root, was a quiet but undeniable truth that had been proven in front of an entire community and eventually an entire nation watching through countless screens. No one stood above the law, not the officer who had abused his authority through years of unchecked bias, and not the institutions that had allowed his behavior to persist far longer than it ever should have. Even those sworn to enforce the law remained bound by its principles, accountable to the same standards of fairness and dignity that protected every citizen regardless of status, position, or the color of their skin. It was a lesson learned in the hard way in a public parking lot in front of strangers with their phones raised, but it was a lesson that ultimately reshaped a department, restored a measure of faith for a community long denied it, and reaffirmed through one woman's unwavering composure that true justice could never be allowed to depend on who you happen to be. It individually that they had dismissed Elijah's calm explanations of Shemimaz and physical proof almost immediately, influenced more by his appearance than by anything he had actually said or shown them. The department's Internal Affairs Division opened a formal case, and for the first time that day, questions began shifting away from Elijah and toward the decisions that had led to his humiliation. Clara Winslow found herself unable to shake the memory of Elijah's calm, steady face as he sat cuffed on his own porch, a memory that grew heavier with every hour that passed. She had believed in the moment that she was protecting her new neighborhood, yet she now understood that her fear had been built on nothing more than the color of a man's skin and the clothes he happened to be wearing. Word of what had happened spread quickly along Maple Ridge Lane, carried from porch to porch by neighbors who had witnessed the scene themselves or heard about it from those who had. Some expressed genuine regret, admitting quietly to one another that they too had assumed the worst without ever bothering to ask a single question. Others remained defensive, insisting that anyone would have done the same thing given the circumstances, though their voices carried less conviction than they had that morning. Beneath all the shifting reactions, one truth remained unchanged. A man who had spent his entire career protecting others had been treated as a threat by the very community he had quietly chosen to call home. News of the incident reached local reporters soon after, and the story of a decorated veteran handcuffed outside his own house had spread well beyond the boundaries of the neighborhood. The police chief personally traveled to Maple Ridge Lane to speak with Elijah, arriving without cameras or fanfare, choosing instead a quiet, private conversation on the same porch where the humiliation had taken place. He offered a formal apology on behalf of the department, acknowledging that the officers involved had failed to follow proper procedure and had allowed assumption to override basic investigation. Elijah listened patiently, his expression calm as always, and thanked the chief for coming in person rather than sending a written statement through some distant office. The military, for its part, released a brief but firm confirmation of Elijah's service record, verifying every detail the general had spoken aloud on the lawn that morning. Across the neighborhood, several residents who had recorded mocking videos during the incident quietly deleted the footage from their phones, unable to look at it any longer without feeling the sharp sting of their own judgment. In the days that followed, a handful of veterans from the surrounding area began arriving at Elijah's door, some driving hours simply to shake his hand and thank him for a service they had only just learned the full extent of. Elijah welcomed each of them with the same quiet humility he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, offering coffee and conversation rather than any grand statements about what he had endured. He refused every opportunity to criticize the officers involved by name, declining interview requests from reporters eager to turn his story into a spectacle of outrage. When one journalist pressed him for a strong statement condemning the police department, Elijah simply replied that honor did not require applause and that he had never done what he did in life for recognition. His restraint surprised many who expected anger. Yet those who knew him, even briefly, understood that this composure was simply who Elijah had always been. It was not the absence of pain, but the presence of a discipline built over years of choosing dignity over vengeance. Among the veterans who came to visit was a man named Wallace Brennan, gray-haired and walking with a slight limp, who had served under Elijah during the same mission the general had described. Wallace stood on the porch for a long moment before he could speak, finally telling Elijah in a voice thick with emotion that he had a daughter now, grown and married with children of her own, none of whom would exist if Elijah had not carried him out of that ravine so many years before. Elijah invited him inside, and the two men sat for hours over coffee, trading quiet memories that neither had spoken aloud in years, memories that belonged only to the small circle of people who had lived through them together. Wallace admitted that he had followed news of the story, and that seeing his old commander humiliate the international terminal in Los Angeles was already crowded. A river of rolling suitcases and tired travelers moved beneath fluorescent lights that never seemed to dim. Somewhere in that river walked a woman in a faded hoodie and worn jeans, pulling a cheap suitcase with a broken wheel that squeaked against the tile. She looked like nobody in particular, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Nobody in that terminal could have guessed that the quiet woman gripping a scuffed backpack strap had once been trained to disappear into martial rooms full of danger and walk out without leaving a single trace. Before long, a police officer would slam his boot into her leg in front of hundreds of witnesses, accusing her of resisting arrest for a crime she had nothing to do with. Cell phones would rise into the air, screams would echo off the terminal ceiling, and nobody standing there filming would understand that they were about to witness the awakening of a woman the government itself had once been too afraid to name out loud. Her name was Sienna Harlow, and she was 34 years old, though something in the stillness of her eyes made her seem both younger and far older than that number suggested. She wore no jewelry, carried no expensive luggage, and moved through the terminal with the unhurried patience of someone who had learned a long time ago that panic never solved anything. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman heading home from a long shift, or perhaps a traveler stretching a modest budget across a long trip. In truth, she was flying to Washington to start a quiet, unremarkable civilian job. The kind of position that came with a badge that opened doors but never announced itself. She had chosen it on purpose. After everything she had lived through, she wanted mornings that felt ordinary, coffee that tasted like nothing more than coffee, and a life where nobody looked twice at her. Even so, certain habits refused to leave her body no matter how many years passed. She counted exits without meaning to, cataloging every door, every stairwell, every gap in the crowd where danger could slip through unnoticed. She never sat with her back to an open room. She noticed the rhythm of footsteps around her the way other people noticed music, picking out anything that broke the pattern. She had once explained this briefly and reluctantly to a therapist assigned to her after leaving the service, who had gently suggested that such hypervigilance might ease with time. It had not eased, not fully, though she had learned to carry it quietly, folding it into the background of an otherwise unremarkable life, rather than letting it define her every waking moment. These were not choices anymore. They were instincts carved so deep into her that she barely registered doing them, the same way a person breathes without thinking about their lungs. Years earlier, before the quiet apartment and the modest wardrobe and the careful anonymity, Sienna had served in a classified special operations unit that did not exist on paper, the kind of unit whose members were erased from official records the moment they were recruited. She had walked into embassies under siege and walked out again before backup even arrived. She had done things that saved lives and things she chose never to speak of again. Now she simply wanted to be forgotten. And for years, the world had cooperated. Years earlier, in a life she rarely allowed herself to remember in detail, Sienna had operated under conditions that most people could never imagine surviving even once, let alone repeatedly across a decade of service. She had spent nights in places without names on any official map, waiting in silence for hours at a time, trained to control her own heartbeat the way other people controlled their breathing. She had learned to read a room in a matter of seconds to identify the single most dangerous person in a crowd before that person even realized they had been noticed. That training had cost her friendships, relationships, entire years of her life spent invisible to everyone who might have loved her. And when she finally left the service, she carried both pride and quiet grief in equal measure. She told herself boarding that flight in Los Angeles that those years were finally behind her, that the woman in the hoodie pulling a broken suitcase was simply Sienna now, nothing more and nothing less. The morning felt ordinary in every visible way, the kind of morning that gives no warning of what it is about to become. Announcements crackled overhead, a toddler cried somewhere near the coffee kiosk, and a line of passengers inched forward through the security checkpoint with the practiced boredom of frequent flyers. Sienna checked the time on a cracked phone screen, calculated how long she had before boarding, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine the calm apartment waiting for her on the other coast. She had no idea that a young officer standing near the gate had already noticed her, had already begun building a story about her in his mind that had nothing to do with the truth. She had no idea that the story would nearly cost her everything she had worked so hard to leave behind. Officer Blake Rourke had been on the force for only a short time, and in that brief span he had developed a reputation among his colleagues for two things: an eagerness to prove himself and a temper that flared faster than it should have. He wanted commendations, he wanted his name mentioned in briefings, he wanted, more than almost anything, to be the officer who caught something big on an otherwise uneventful shift, and that hunger made him dangerous in a way none of his supervisors had fully addressed. His training officer had warned him twice already about jumping to conclusions before gathering facts, but Blake had brushed off both warnings as the caution of someone too timid to make real decisions in the field. He believed, with the unshakable confidence of the inexperienced, that his instincts were sharper than his colleagues gave him credit for, and he had been waiting for a chance to prove it. As he scanned the crowd near the business class corridor, his eyes landed on Sienna, and within seconds he had already decided who she was without asking a single question. To Blake, everything about her seemed wrong for the space she occupied. Her clothes were plain, her suitcase was old, she traveled alone, and she was walking near a section of the terminal reserved for travelers who, in his mind, looked nothing like her. He noticed her skin before he noticed anything else about her, and though he would never admit that out loud, it shaped every judgment that followed. He told himself he was simply being observant, simply doing his job, simply trusting the instincts his training had supposedly sharpened. In reality, he was building a case against an innocent woman based on nothing but appearance and prejudice dressed up as procedure. The excuse arrived a short while later, small and almost meaningless, the kind of accident that happens in crowded places 100 times a day. A businessman rushing toward his gate bumped into another traveler and dropped his wallet without noticing, the leather billfold sliding across the polished floor and coming to rest near a support pillar. Nobody around him seemed to notice, except Blake, who scanned the immediate area and once again fixed his attention on Sienna, standing roughly 10 feet away with her eyes on the departure board. He did not check security footage. He did not ask the businessman a single clarifying question. He did not consider, even briefly, any explanation other than the one his bias had already written for him. He crossed the floor toward her with the exaggerated confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome of an encounter that had not yet begun. Sienna noticed him approaching and felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever authority moved toward her without warning, a feeling she had learned to manage through years of discipline rather than instinct. She met his eyes calmly, waiting to hear what he wanted, prepared to cooperate the way she always did in ordinary civilian life. When he accused her of taking the wallet, she blinked in genuine surprise, then explained evenly and politely that she had not touched anyone's belongings and had been standing near the pillar simply checking her flight information. Blake did not listen. He demanded she hand over her bag immediately, his voice rising loud enough to draw glances from nearby travelers. Several people slowed their pace to watch, sensing the tension building between them, while others quickened their steps instinctively, eager to avoid whatever was unfolding near the pillar. Sienna, still calm, offered to open her bag voluntarily, explaining that he was welcome to look through it if it would resolve the misunderstanding quickly. Instead of accepting her cooperation, Blake grabbed her arm and shoved her toward the pillar, his grip far rougher than any situation like this required. Something in the crowd shifted immediately, phones lifting into the air as people sensed that they were witnessing something they needed to record. Sienna kept her hands visible, her voice steady, repeating that she was not resisting and had done nothing wrong. But Blake's anger had already outpaced his judgment entirely. Then, without warning, he swept his boot against the back of her leg, driving her down onto the hard terminal floor in front of everyone. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Sienna's knees struck the tile, the sound sharp enough to silence nearby conversations instantly. She caught herself with one hand, refusing to fully collapse, but her expression tightening not with fear, but with a kind of controlled disbelief that came